Hello, good evening. Whoa, geez, that's loud. Hi, how's everybody doing tonight? Thank you all so much for coming out to talk about such an important issue on such a beautiful, sunny weekday night. Very much appreciate you all coming down here. My name's Ben. I'm a campaigner with the Wilderness Committee. And we're just about to get underway, so I'll just give everybody a second to find your seats and get ready to go. Is everybody having a good day? Cool. So, to get us started tonight, the first person you're going to hear from is Rueben George from the Tsleil-Waututh First Nation. Rueben, how do I describe Rueben George? Rueben has become one of my very best friends in the last little while. He's a really inspiring speaker, spiritual leader, a community organizer, and just a really swell guy. Rueben has just recently made a big transition in his life, and he'll probably tell you more about this himself. But for many years, Ruben's been doing work for the Tsleil-Waututh community, and before that for the Tulalip community in the United States, helping people. And it's a new thing for him to get involved in an environmental campaign, and he has gone from sort of just first getting involved in this about a year ago to now he's actually taken a leave of absence from his full-time job to work full-time on trying to stop the Kinder Morgan pipeline proposal. So I'm probably stealing all of Ruben's thunder because I think he was going to tell you about that. I've heard his opening remarks before. But I'm just going to ask Rueben to come up here, and Ruben's going to give some opening remarks and a traditional greeting. So please welcome Rueben George.
It's funny, I always think of these really beautiful introductions, and it's just me and Ben and I talk, and we say, I was telling Ben, I said, we're just a couple dorks. He says, I'm highly aware of that. But hey, Siam, Hoichka Siam, Siaya, Hoichka Chesiam, Chief Skaloots, Nansnot to Tsleil-Waututh, Chief Yupan, Nansnot to Tsleil-Waututh, Squamish. I acknowledge the spirit of the oneness that we all belong to. Your spirit, our collective spirit, and what we could do with our spirit when we come together in a place like this. I acknowledge my ancestral line from the Tsleil-Waututh and from the Squamish and the territory that we sit here today. But really thank you, Ben, for the work you're doing, and I would not have done the change in the career of doing what I'm doing if it wasn't for Ben and Phil Lane Jr. and other people, but more importantly is the spirit that we've been following. Ben has been coming to ceremony with some of us at Tsleil-Waututh for over a year now. And it's funny because when I think of some of our traditional ways, we see the first thing that a woman should, or a man should honor and work towards to improve in their life and to protect is the woman. Then the children, then the family, then the community, then himself. And then Earth and the Creator. And I think maybe I got a hold of some of these things that I need to take care of. My beautiful son's here, my daughter's here, and I've been teaching them a lot of the work that I've been doing. We were at a conference, and there's 2,000 elders that were there, and I had to run around and do some running around. So I left my 13-year-old daughter there for a little bit, and I was proud enough to hear a real beautiful moment where the lady was going, "Oh my God, here you are, just such a little girl. Talking about what you're talking about. I should be the one that's making the difference and talking to you to try to save a better future for you. And here you are teaching me." And she goes, "Wow, we have a voice too." Then I walked away and I said, "So proud of you, Kaya. I'm so proud of what you're doing." And she goes, "It's not hard when you're passionate about the things you love and the things you want to protect." And then my heart just sank, and I was like, such a proud father moment. But it makes me think too of where we're at and where we're going and what it's going to take. We have to give us as human beings our heads a shake. There are alternatives to the fossil fuels that we're burning. what they want to move in Alberta is the size of the country of France. When they burn that oil and they separate the oil from the dirt, there's chemicals released in our atmosphere that's are helping to raise the temperature of our earth. One of my elders, when we had a community forum like this and we voted on it, said, do we want to work towards stopping this, or do we want to work out some sort of agreement with them? One of our elders stood up and said, just because our relatives in Alberta have such a high concentration rate that some of them are dying, that's reason enough for us to say no. So we voted, and it was 100% consensus that we want to oppose what's going on. We want to oppose because, there's more than what I feel is saving our earth. It's saving a big part of who we are. We have our lineage, what I am taught, comes from that water. We're called Tsleil-Waututh people, which means people of the ocean, people of this Burrard Inlet. That's our lineage directly of where we come from. And since I was a child, I've been raised that way, to have a loving and a spiritual connection to those waters. I say this often, and I hear my family talk about it often. And even before we started getting involved with this, they would tell me, they said when the tide went out, the table was set. We'd walk out onto the waters, and we'd pick up crab, and we'd harvest clams, and we would eat them. And then we'd play in the water. We'd have canoe festivals in the water, where all the Salish in the Stylo Valley and the Fraser River, we'd get together and have these annual canoe races against one another. One of my spiritual teachers from the Lakotas, he came up and he came to visit us, and he put his hand over the canoe, and he said, the scripts of your people are written on the bottoms of this canoe. And that's how we feel. Next week I'm going on a canoe journey, and there's probably going to be over 200 nations represented. And where they start in some places like in Haida or Bella Bella, and every village on the way they stop. And when they stop, another canoe joins them, and they keep coming, and where it's going to end is in Olympia, Washington this year. And we talk about the same thing. We talk about the same connections. We talk, because what I was always taught is the waterways of the waterways here were the highways of our people. That's how we traveled and communicated with one another, is on top of those waters. And consistently, it's the same story, the same teachings about how we have a loving connection to the water. And statistically, I was the director of community development, like Ben said, and my whole life has been dedicated to helping people. And it's what I turned out to be pretty good at. But what I would say consistently is we're only 2% of Canada's population, but we're 20% of the jail population. We're 20% homeless. We're 20% of school dropouts. Statistically, that's not good. And but one thing that I know, and when myself, I grew up in poverty. One thing that I know is that what helped me through these hard times, what helped me through some of the hurt and pains, and what I really feel what helped some of my people was the spiritual connections that they had with the land and with the water. That during those hard times, they pulled it through. That's why today, these oil companies can come through and say, well, we'll offer you millions of dollars. What kind of people wouldn't take that to help themselves out of poverty? Who wouldn't do that? Who wouldn't take millions of dollars to help feed their family and their kids and homes and better education, whatever it might be? But consistently, I'm proud to say, just like myself, how I've been raised to have a spiritual connection to the water. 206 nations from British Columbia, from Alberta, from the Yukon territories are saying no. They're saying no the spiritual connections that we have, the loving connections that we have, the things that help us to create us to be a better human being are embedded in our lands of where we live. The fundamentals of humanity, of what me and Ben talk about in the ceremonies that we attend, of love, honor, respect, dignity, pride, passion, compassion, understanding, and truth, those are the teachings of humanity. And those are the things of what I learned in my life that I apply to the people that I'm helping. But now in my new job, I apply to the work that I'm doing. And I think now too, it's like, I was saying last night, my daughter and I went to a movie, and it was Abraham Lincoln versus the vampires. I couldn't pick a better superhero there. But he talked at the end of the movie, and they recited part of his speech. And he said, the reason why we went to war was to save lives for people to have a better life and a better future for our future generations. Then we heard those words again here in North America not long ago. Malcolm X, Martin Luther King, Kennedy, they all stood up in the civil rights and they said the same thing. We need a better future. We need something that we can all come together with those teachings of humanity, what I was talking about, and treat each other that way. So again, in different ways they saved lives again and made a difference where a country of people stood up. And that's what we need again. We need that again to understand and to know that we're going to save lives. But what we got to explain to people is it's not just our lives as the First Nations that we're going to save. Not our lives as the environmentalists, what we're going to save, but we're going to save the lives of even the people that are blinded by whatever's standing in their way from being a better human being. We're going to save the lives of Kinder Morgan. We're going to save the lives for their future generations. We're going to save their lives just because they're blind. And sometimes I say, when I run ceremonies, I say, I'm probably not the best example of how to be a healthy person. I have my own dysfunctions. But I'm here to be better too. I'm here to move forward too. I'm here and I want to identify the things that are wrong with myself. And I want to be better. And they do too, I believe. Because where do we live here in British Columbia? Is said on our license plate is the most beautiful place on earth. Tell me there hasn't been a moment in your life that when you were maybe hurting or you're sad and you maybe somehow ended up on the water or ended up in the wilderness and you felt better. That's because you too as a human being have the hereditary right to have that connection about what I'm talking about. And that connection right there is worth fighting for. Because our land has a spirit and that's worth fighting for. Our children deserve that. All of our children deserve that. And we'll do what I can and make sure I do what I can to make sure that we stop them. We stop them because my elders say no. Because our people say no and because you say no. There are alternatives to Tsleil-Waututh Nation. Even before we got involved in this, even before we started getting involved in the tankers, and even, I was still happy working in my job, and I'm happy right now doing what I'm doing. But we got an investment of wind turbines, TWN wind power. There are alternatives. There's 3-to-1 jobs and green energy jobs opposed to fossil fuel jobs. There are alternatives. If we take the $1.4 billion subsidies that the government's given to fossil fuels and direct it towards something better that could help us all, that's something that we should lean towards. Sorry, maybe something that we won't lean towards. This is something that we will make happen. This is something that we'll make happen and we'll make sure. Because as our ancestors came together before, in the 70s with the leaders of Kennedy and Malcolm X and Martin Luther King, as they did with Lincoln, we'll come together again as a country of a people and say no more. Because we deserve it. Our earth deserves it, and each and every one of you deserve it. And like I said, Kinder Morgan and these other oil companies, even though they might be blind, will teach them because they deserve it. So thank you very much. Thank you very much. Thank you, my friend Ben and your staff for putting this on. And I do welcome you to our traditional territory. I thank you, and if there's a prayer and a thought that I could leave in this room, it's something that we always talk about, and that's one heart and one mind. One heart and one mind. And to go in the same direction, to come together with the same soul and the same spirit in one direction, and move forward and make something happen. If there's a prayer that I could do, that is that we could do that, and all of us could be a pebble that's thrown into the pond and ripple out to the people, ripple out to them with our message that we want to save them, that we want to do something for them. One thing that we talk about now, one thing I say, no more rallies, no more protests. It's a time of teaching, because when people are taught and they learn a better way, they're going to make a better choice too. And I really believe in that, and I have faith in the people of Vancouver and the people of British Columbia and the people of Canada, the people of North America. I have faith in that. So if there's a prayer that I could leave with each and every one of us, is I pray that you take this message out, because we need everybody involved. We need everybody to make a difference. So thank you very much for being here. Thank you. I'd like to introduce an elder that I've been looking up to, who's been huge in my dad's side of the family in Squamish, and moving that nation forward, moving my family's nation forward, and just being a pioneer in the ways to help educate all of us on Squamish. And so I'd like to ask my teacher, Chief Bill Williams, to come up and to also give a prayer and give a welcome. Let's give him a big round of applause.
Boichika, Queen Sna Thalasson Kings, and Squamish. Thalasson gave my ancestral name. I am one of 16 hereditary chiefs of the Squamish Nation. I'd like to hold my hand up and say Kayachton. And with that, I know where your hearts and your minds are leaning towards by being here tonight, by setting aside the time to be a part of this. Because I believe it is significant. I'd like to thank each and every one of you on behalf of the Squamish community, part of the Coast Salish tribes that also, like Musqueam and its relatives, are trying to look after the land the best way we can. It's a daunting task. When we take a look at our population of Squamish, it's 3,800, and 60% of them are under the age of 25. So we have a very young population. And so we have to do a lot of teaching, a lot of educating to our young people. And that's consumed a lot of our time. Unfortunately, one of the things that we have to do too is we have to make sure that our education of who we are and where we come from is spread out throughout all of Vancouver. So the 4 million people that live in Vancouver have an understanding of their history, of the land that is here, that you live on, they live around, and the water that you go into, and the names of those places that reflect who Squamish are in Swelitude, in Musqueam communities. We really believe and always have wanted to have the lifestyle that we had before contact, because at that time we had life easy. I know that because we lived in long houses right beside the beaches, and we can go out and, as discussed, we can go out and get the food that we want right at our doorstep. It was a different time. When I was talking to my grandmother, and I was blessed to be with my grandmother from the age of 5 to about the age of 11. I lived in her house, and she lived to the age of 98 years. She was born in a village called Snock, or people today call it Kitsilano, in 1875. Learning what she had to tell me about her husband, where the family chieftainship comes from, is handed to my father and then to myself. One of the things that she mentioned is that Squamish community at one point in time, she was told, was 125,000 people. 125,000 Squamish people living in our traditional territory. So that's not a small number. Because of the diseases and other things that happened, we shrunk down to a population in 1900 to about 500. So all the tribes in British Columbia, probably right across Canada, was impacted the same way. What we want to be able to do with your help is to echo our voice, echo our concern of what's happening out to the land and right now to the water. I am one of the 3 representatives of the Squamish Nation that sit on the Coast Salish Chiefs Committee. And the Coast Salish Chiefs Committee is all the 120-odd tribes that live in the Coast Salish territory that are called Salish, according to the anthropologists. And about 6 or 8 years ago, we tried to, and we did very successfully push the American government and then the provincial government to change the inlet to the Salish Sea. So all the tribes that live in the Salish Sea have been working together, the chiefs, to try and make a difference. The difference that the Squamish Nation made was to clean up the mouth of the Squamish. We brought in the old eelgrass and other natural grass that always grew in the mouth of the Squamish, and pretty soon the herring came back and other species of fish started to show up. We had gray whales show up about 3 years ago, and that was the first time a gray whale wandered into the mouth of the Squamish, around the mouth of the Squamish River in about 90 years. In the last couple of weeks, there's been a very small pod, about 4 orcas, killer whales that went wandering up there. We've had 150, 200 porpoises go up there chasing the herrings. We had a herring spawn this year that went, I don't know if you know, from the mouth of the Squamish River right down to about Bowen Island, on the west side of the Squamish. And that was the first time that the herring had spawned so well along there. And so things have been changing because thankfully wood fiber closed about 15, 20 years ago. Thankfully the chemical plant that was at the mouth of the Squamish closed about 20 years ago. And we've been working at trying to change other things that have happened. And one of the things 6 years ago that we did with mentioned the canoe journey. All the tribes, there's about last year there was 112 ocean-going canoes went to one location, and we asked each skipper to throw out a special bottle, and they collected water at certain times of the day, and they put the bottle aside, and then we sent it to be analyzed, so we know what the quality of the water is around each of the villages, right from the northern part of our Salish Sea right to the southern part of our Salish Sea. And we are the only organization in North America that has, in fact, an international database on the quality of water along the Pacific Northwest. The Government of Canada the Government of Canada is really trying to get a hold of our data to show off that they can actually do some analysis on international waters. The American government is doing exactly the same thing. They want to get a hold of our database to be able to show the American population that they can get information on the international waters between the United States and Canada. But we are keeping that close to ourselves, and we're only using it in demonstrations and showing what has happened to the Sailor Sea and what can happen if a tribe like Squamish looks after our small little footprint of where we live and what is around us. And that's what we're starting to ask other people like yourselves to start looking after the small footprint where you live, where you want to go, where you go to all the time, where you bring your family, where you bring your kids. So you know that the water is going to be safe, it's going to be clean, it's going to be fun to use and play with. And that's what we want, to be able to go back in that general direction. But we can't do it without your help. We need your voice. We need you to be able to speak out, because we've tried, and our voice is small, and we need a larger voice, like your voice, to speak amongst yourselves, speak to your friends, and let them know what's going on, and help the way you just showed up tonight, and done the good things. So, Hoichika, I thank you for setting aside the time of day to be here.
Thank you both for that beautiful greeting and welcome. My name is Ben West. I'm a campaigner for a group called the Wilderness Committee. Has everybody here heard of the Wilderness Committee before? So I figure probably most of you did, but just in case. Wilderness Committee is Canada's largest membership-based wilderness preservation organization. It would be rude of me not to introduce to you Paul George, who's sitting over there, the founder of the Wilderness Committee. You may or may not know that Paul is Councillor Adrian Carr's husband, so quite a power-packed duo over there. And 30 some odd years ago, Paul founded the Wilderness Committee. Now I'm lucky enough to work there. The Wilderness Committee is quite actively working on this campaign to fight oil tankers now. And what you're looking at on the screen behind you is our campaign paper, and we're going to talk about the Stanley Park Report today, but first I'll just point out this new paper that we produced. We actually distributed 50,000 copies of that in less than 2 months, if you can believe it, which is pretty unheard of, I think, when it comes to sort of the amount of distribution of a campaign paper. As an anecdote, if nothing else, it tells you that people are overwhelmingly concerned about this issue and quite eager to do something about it. And that's what we're going to try to talk about today, is not only what's at stake, but what we can do about it. And we've been trying to produce resources for people that you can use to actually get involved in the fight. That's why we called our paper Want to Help Stop an Oil Spill. So we sort of did this overarching information paper to talk about the issue of oil tankers, oil pipelines, and oil spills. This paper looks at the Enbridge pipeline, the Kinder Morgan pipeline, and the Keystone XL pipeline, because they're all related projects, really. But what we're here to talk about today is the report that we've just done about Stanley Park and the potential impact on the Stanley Park if an oil spill was going to take place. So just in terms of process, so you know what to expect from tonight, I'm going to provide a bit of an overview presentation. I'm going to give you a little bit of a taste of the Stanley Park report, and also just sort of a bit of a backgrounder on the issue for anybody who's not super familiar. I'm going to focus primarily on the Kinder Morgan pipeline tonight, because we're talking about Stanley Park and we're talking about the impact of a spill in Burrard Inlet, which is basically related to the Kinder Morgan pipeline. And then after me, we're going to hear from Robyn Worcester from the Stanley Park Ecology Society. And I can tell you that without the work that the Stanley Park Ecology Society's done with their State of the Park report, it wouldn't have been possible to do the report that we're going to talk about today. So thanks for that. And then after that, we're going to hear from Niki Sharma from Vancouver Parks Board. And the Parks Board, along with our City Council, has been showing tremendous leadership in the opposition to these pipeline projects, in particular to Kinder Morgan. And so I think it's great that we've got Niki here to talk about the Parks Board's perspective on all this. And then finally, last but not least, we've got Sven from Tanker Free BC. So Tanker Free BC, if you haven't heard of it, is the new organization that Rex Weiler, who was the lead author of our report, unfortunately he's out of town right now, so he couldn't be with us today. But you're in good hands with Sven. Sven's just started working full-time for Tanker Free BC, And we'll kind of round out the night talking about our organizing efforts that we're collaborating on, and the town hall meetings like this one that we're planning on holding all around Burrard Inlet and along the pipeline route. So this is the first of the series that you're here for today. So everybody ready? All right. So I'm going to get right into it. Before I start, actually, I'm just going to introduce you to our new mascot. See that little cartoon killer whale there? So we were trying to have a contest to determine what the name of that little mascot should be. And I actually went to a friend of Ruben's, a guy named Luke Thomas, and I asked him, if he had any suggestions for a name. And I thought he might give me some beautiful name in a traditional language, something really deep, spiritual meaning or something. And he said, "How about Tanker Free Willie?" But it's such a cool name that's the one we picked. So thanks to Luke Thomas for that name. I think it's important to try to have a lighthearted approach when you're dealing with serious issues, and these issues can be really overwhelming. So forgive me if I make jokes about things that are really serious, because of course this is very serious. But we have to enjoy our lives somewhere in the midst of all this. But Tanker Free Willie, I think, carries with him an important message, and there's a reason why we gave that cute little guy that sign. We're trying to draw attention to this idea that what we're trying to do isn't just stop any one particular pipeline project. Because if you stop any one of these companies, somebody else is going to come by and try to make money the same way, try to get that oil to market. So what we're really trying to do is stop tar sands exports. We're trying to stop the Enbridge pipeline. We're trying to stop the Kinder Morgan pipeline. We're trying to stop the Keystone XL pipeline. So that's our overarching goal. So just as a frame to kind of begin the conversation tonight, that's ultimately what we're asking for. And if you look at our newspaper, you'll see that quite clearly laid out. So as the first of our series of reports and town hall meetings, we decided that focusing on Stanley Park made a lot of sense. I, for one, grew up, some of my first memories are playing on the beaches of Stanley Park. Stanley Park is just one of those places that you can't even think about Vancouver without thinking about it. It's really a symbol of our city in a lot of ways. It's one of those must-see places for tourists when they come to town. A lot of people go on their first dates there. It's where we spend a lot of our time. And of course, it's smack dab in the middle of the inlet. When you look at that park, it really looks like a giant target in a sense. It's right in the middle of the inlet. It gets hit by the tides in a couple of different directions. And if there was a spill anywhere in the inlet or in the Strait of Georgia, that park could be very heavily impacted. And of course, you just by looking at it, you don't even need the report. You can sort of figure that out. Most people can sort of figure out oil and water don't mix. Oil and nature don't go very well together. But we wanted to take it a step further than that. We know that people love Stanley Park, and we know that people are quite concerned about this issue of pipelines and tankers. And like I said, we're trying to provide resources for people. So what we did is we basically took the State of the Park report that I told you about with all of its data, and then we tried to sort of extrapolate from that based on other case studies of oil spills, most notably the Kalamazoo River spill that you've probably heard a lot about in the news recently. We've tried to sort of take what we can learn from these experiences, from these other oil spill incidents, and what we know already about Stanley Park, and then sort of project worst case scenario, what could happen. And I think this is important, because really when you're talking about trafficking oil, it's not a matter of if there's going to be a spill, it's a matter of when. Oil spills are really just part of the business, and I'll talk a bit more about that. But some people have said, well, aren't you just fear-mongering? And the truth is, I'm scared. So I would feel responsible if I didn't pass on that concern to other people. I think the last thing we want to do is be looking back at this and say, why didn't somebody warn us? Why didn't somebody tell us what was at stake? Why didn't somebody think this through a little bit more carefully before we went headlong into it? So I'm just going to jump ahead a little bit to this. This is one of the families, John LaForge, his family was one of the first ones to be aware when the spill happened in Kalamazoo. And I bring him up at this point because I was just recently reading the story of what his experience and what his family's experience was when the Kalamazoo River incident happened. And something was in this report that I wasn't expecting actually, which was the number one thing that they were concerned about was the smell. They were sitting in their home one day and all of a sudden there was just this rancid odor, this nauseating odor that smelled like rotten eggs was the way they described it. It was literally so bad that within a very short period of time they abandoned their house and didn't even think to lock the door They just got the heck out of there as quickly as they could. And about 300 properties were abandoned in that same way because of the Kalamazoo River spill. And the vast majority of them have been completely abandoned. People have not returned to their homes. In fact, the LaForge family, when they returned to their property, they went back a couple of weeks later to try to sort of reclaim some of their, most important sort of things that they owned. Like your kids' clothes that they wore to their first day of school, or your old wedding dress. And what they said was that everything was so embedded with that smell that they wouldn't even take it with them. They basically just left everything the way that it was in their home. Like there'd been a hurricane or a natural disaster or something. I mean, they just literally left everything where it was as the result of that smell. And I think this is one of those things that it almost seems trifling to focus on odor when we're talking about oil spills and health risks and climate change and all these big scale issues. But when you sort of map that idea onto Stanley Park, and you think to yourself, what could happen if there was an oil spill, even a relatively small one? Small oil spills still smell really bad, even if they're contained, even if they're cleaned up. They create quite a disturbance. So, that was one of the first things that really occurred to me when we were talking about Stanley Park and talking about this report was, well, could you imagine that you were walking down that seawall one day and all of a sudden you smelled a smell like that made just everybody want to get the heck out of the park? And I think if a spill actually happened, this would probably be what the experience was like. Before anybody actually knew what was happening, you would just smell something awful and a lot of people would be wondering, and who would you call? Yeah, I don't know. Would you call the Ecology Society? Maybe you would. Maybe you'd call the Wilderness Committee. Maybe you'd call the Parks Board. But I don't think anybody really knows who you're supposed to call. And we'll talk a bit more about how much we're actually cutting the infrastructure for dealing with responding to a spill of what happened. But I thought that was an important place to start because it's really tangible. This is what happens when there's oil spills. There was just recently a spill on Sumas Mountain. There's actually been 4 of them at this pump station on Sumas Mountain in Abbotsford. And when the spill happened, people told me that in the time it took them to walk from their front door to their car in the morning, it was so nauseating that they had a headache, and some people even came home from work. Kids were locked in the school. The teachers were scared of what was going on inside, didn't really know what to expect. And there was hours that went by where people were basically trying to figure out what the heck was going on. Calling Kinder Morgan, calling the RCMP, calling the fire department, basically just calling anybody. And for hours, people were being told that there was no problem. And the same thing happened with the Kalamazoo River spill. So hopefully we don't ever have this situation. But just as sort of a what this would actually be like in tangible terms, I think this is a useful starting point. It's also worth remembering that oil spills have happened here before. There was actually 2 of them in 1973, believe it or not. Relatively small spills, but this is just a little picture, a reminder of the history of our city. Here there are citizens in Vancouver, pitching in and literally picking up shovels and shoveling up oil. And I'll get to this in a sec, but what you're going to learn is that the oil that is at Stanley Park, that is threatening Stanley Park right now, the bitumen in diluted form, is very different than what these guys were cleaning up with their shovels here. This was a particularly nasty experience at the time, and they were relatively small incidents. But it's very, very different than the kind of oil we're dealing with today. So why are we having this conversation? Well, it all really comes down to the Trans Mountain Pipeline, or as I like to call it now, the Kinder Morgan Pipeline. For anybody who's unfamiliar with it, the Trans Mountain Pipeline, and this is of course for many people the first time they were exposed to it when it ruptured in 2007. Does everybody remember this? Does anybody remember when that oil spill happened in the 70s, just out of curiosity? I'd love to talk to you more about that at some point. But this oil spill incident, for many, many people, was the first time they'd ever heard of the Trans Mountain Pipeline. We don't often think about, where does our oil come from, where does our water come from, that sort of thing. But for many people, this was a first experience. It was relatively small, about 1,000 barrels. The spill lasted about 15 minutes, about a 30-foot gusher, and the result of it looked something like that from the aerial view. A number of people's homes were affected. I can tell you, I went and knocked on doors in this neighborhood in Burnaby, around where the terminal is, and many of the people whose doors we knocked on, who literally had oil in their backyard. You've heard of not in my backyard issues, and this is literally people with oil in their backyard. They did not know, many of these people did not know that Kinder Morgan had actually increased the amount of oil that was going under their backyards, a couple of years after the spill. People actually didn't know. They hadn't been consulted. Nobody had come talk to them about it. There's actually 50,000 more barrels per day going under those homes than when this happened. And many of these people who, as you could imagine, were quite concerned about the spill, didn't know about that increase and didn't know that there was a proposal coming down the pipe, so to speak, which would drastically increase how much Kinder Morgan wanted to export through our inlet. As I said, pipeline spills are part of the business. And don't take my word for it, this is the National Energy Board's report on the number of oil spills in Canada in the last decade. If you add them up, there was about 411 as of 2009, between 2000 and 2009. And that ranges from smaller incidents to bigger ones. But, just a reminder, oil spills happen all the time. They're often small incidents, they're often contained, but it still doesn't seem small if you live in the area where you're being affected by it. Another thing that doesn't get talked about enough is this idea of normal spillage. These pipeline companies actually account in their accounting principles for losing a small amount of oil for every barrel. There's a calculation right off the Enbridge Gateway Pipeline website where they say that they lose about a teaspoon of oil for every barrel. And what they've told us is that, are you delivering a better microphone to me? Thank you. I don't know if I'm going to be able to put that on while I'm talking to you. All right. What they've told us is that they lose about a teaspoon of oil for every barrel. So what this blogger did is they basically just did a calculation. Okay, well, how many barrels over how many kilometers? And the end result is that on an annual basis, Enbridge anticipates to lose about 800 barrels of oil annually. That's without a spill. That's just normal operations. So it's worth remembering that even without a spill, there's small amounts of oil on a regular basis leaking into ecosystems. It's not at all in one place. It's in a variety of locations. It's a little bit at a time. But of course, that adds up and accumulates in our ecosystems and has an impact. So just to sort of give you a picture of what it is that we're talking about here, I'm sure most of you are quite familiar with the red line on the top. Does everybody know what that is? Yeah, somebody tell me. Thank you. I'm trying to be participatory here. All right. So that's the Enbridge pipeline on the top. It's about a 525,000 barrel a day pipeline, moving in one direction oil, and in the other direction this stuff called condensate, which is what's blended with bitumen to make what's called diluted bitumen. I keep calling it diluted. Oh, it must be a Freudian slip or something. The condensate is a mixture of some pretty nasty chemicals, benzenes and other seriously toxic chemicals, which basically make it possible to move this very heavy, thick, tarry substance through a pipe. Makes it viscous enough to actually pump through a pipe. What you see at the bottom is the Trans Mountain Pipeline. It was built in 1952, operational in 1953. It's where about 90% of the oil that we've been using since then has come from. But for most of the lifetime of that pipeline, it was moving light crude, not the heavy stuff. That's actually a pretty new phenomenon. It's only been since the early 2000s that we've actually been, where it's even been economic to extract it. Basically, oil had to reach about $50 a barrel before it made sense to try to get it to market. And it's only really been since Kinder Morgan bought the pipeline in 2005 that it's been transforming into an export pipeline. And of course, what you see over there in the sort of shaded yellow is really the elephant in the room, the tar sands or the oil sands or Mordor or whatever you want to call it. Thank you. We've only extracted a small fraction of what's there. The plan of our federal government is to triple that in size in the next decade. And of course, anybody who's concerned about climate change or concerned about oil spills or concerned about the people who are suffering from rare forms of cancer who live around that area, simply see that as just fundamentally unsustainable. And of course, both of these proposed pipelines are about facilitating that expansion. Right off the top, either one of them would expand the oil sands by about 30%. So the proposal that Kinder Morgan is bringing to the table is they want to take what is now a 300,000 barrel a day pipeline and add a new pipeline next to it. They call it a twinning, but I actually don't think it's a twinning or an expansion of an existing pipeline. I think it's a brand new pipeline that they're trying to get built by having bought a previous pipeline. They basically were smart enough to say, maybe it'll be easier to build our pipeline if we if we buy another one, and then we can use the existing right-of-way and get our project put through. So they bought this pipeline. And in the short period of time that they've owned it, there was an incident on the Sumas Mountain that I talked about. There was that rupture in 2007. There was also a small spill on Burnaby Mountain in 2009. There was another incident in 2005, right before they bought it, which was a much bigger spill on Sumas Mountain. So if somebody tells you that this pipeline's got a great safety record, don't believe them. In fact, the refinery at Cherry Point, which is serviced by this pipeline, exploded not long after the Sumas Mountain spill. They had a large explosion and a fire. So this pipeline's had a series of safety issues over the years, and it's quite an old pipeline. You got a question? Yeah, that's right. Of the 300,000 barrels a day that currently goes through this pipeline, about 100,000 barrels goes down to 2 refineries in Washington. It splits on Sumas Mountain and goes down into Washington State. About 100,000 barrels goes to the airport as jet fuel, and then the other 100,000 barrels gets split between the terminal and the refinery. And what we're seeing now is actually more and more of it going out raw and less going to the refinery. In fact, the refinery is starting to truck in oil because they're not getting enough to service our local consumption. So if anybody tells you this is about having more oil to refine in British Columbia, it's actually exactly the opposite. What we're seeing is less oil going to the refineries. It has something, it's quite similar in some ways to the raw log export issue. Other than the fact that you can't sustainably, have forestry, whereas, fossil fuels need to be phased out. But other than that, there are a lot of similarities between these two issues. We're really increasingly exporting a raw resource and not refining it locally. So the proposal that they've got is to build a new pipeline along next to the Trans Mountain Pipeline, which would bring the total capacity up to around 750,000 barrels. And they've talked about going as high as 850,000 barrels. And in fact, Robyn has done a study that shows both of these pipelines would actually have the capacity to move substantially more oil than what the companies are proposing. The Kinder Morgan pipeline could go up to 1.1 million barrels, which would mean about 400 tankers in the inlet annually, from the 80 that we have currently.
Sir?
Yes.
This project might be easier to defend if the jobs and refining were available in Canada, but Lower Mainland has fewer refineries than it did 50 years ago, like the IO is closed down.
I'm sorry, I'm going to have to interrupt you. We're going to have a chance for question and answer at the end, but I'm already running late, and I'm going to try to get through my presentation. But I would definitely will address your question. I think I know where you're going with it, and I might actually answer it as we go forward. What you're looking at there is the rupture of the pipeline in Kalamazoo. And I put it up actually just because it's sort of striking how small it is. The amount of impact that this tiny little crack has is pretty amazing. And as I said, people were smelling this awful odor for days. And they were calling up the company and complaining. They were calling up local health officials, and people kept being told, "Don't worry about it. There's nothing wrong." And it turned out actually what this study has discovered in this report that's just come out has discovered is that the company thought there was a bubble, an air bubble in the pipeline. So what they did to try to clear the bubble was they actually increased the pressure. So as oil was spilling out into the Kalamazoo River, they were actually pumping it harder and faster to try to deal with their air bubble that they thought they had. And this is really the way that companies know if there's a problem, is when the pressure goes down on their pump stations. Either that or somebody calling them and complaining about a smell. Which there's a lot more people along the Kinder Morgan pipeline route, so maybe there's more people to smell something if something goes wrong. I'm scared of what could happen with the Enbridge pipeline, where a spill could happen where nobody's around. But that's a whole other story. I'm going to talk a little bit more about the diluted bitumen. And this is a big focus of what we talk about in the Stanley Park report, because we really are dealing with something that's brand new. This bitumen is a pretty serious problem. Oh, thank you, Jolyn. The differences are quite striking. What Kinder Morgan says when you ask them about it is that this dilbit, as the industry calls it, is blended at such a level that it floats, that the weight of it when blended is light enough that it actually floats on the surface. And that may be true when it's moving through the pipe, but the experience in Kalamazoo, and this was one of the first times we had an incident with dilbit where there was a spill, so there's a lot to be learned from this incident, was that the toxins in the condensate, they evaporated, which meant that now you've got this toxic cloud floating over the city of benzenes and other harmful toxins. And the heavier tar actually sunk to the bottom in the form of tar balls, which sat then in the sediment and will probably be there for many, many decades to come. And of course, to tie this back to Stanley Park, if you can imagine, these tar balls sinking into the sediment around the seawall, not only is it very difficult to clean up, and not only does it have this awful odor, and not only would the people in the area be exposed to these horrible toxins, but when you're looking at an ecosystem, I mean, all these things are connected, and I'm sure you'll hear more about this from Robyn and from Niki. When you affect that sedimentary basin, when you affect the biofilm, around the inlet, what you end up seeing is that it works its way up the food chain. The smaller creatures eat the toxins that accumulates in their bodies, and then when that's eaten by larger species, you actually see higher concentrations of those toxins, and that works its way up the food chain. And some of the effects are seen right away. I mean, you see birds covered in oil, and it's horrible. And many species die as the end result immediately. But many of the results aren't seen for many years. If you look at the Exxon Valdez as an example, after that oil spill took place, it was actually, decades later now, we're seeing that whole pods of orca whales haven't had new calves. There's one particular pod that was a unique pod, the A1 pod it was called. And 9 of the 22 of them died right away. But since then, they've had no new calves. So I mean, this is basically a unique pod that will never, continue to exist once the existing members, die off. So it's important for us to remember that ecosystems are connected, and things happen over a long time frame. Just because you don't see all the impact immediately doesn't mean that these impacts aren't long lasting and quite serious. So moving from pipelines to tankers, of course, who can forget the Exxon Valdez? You can't have a conversation about oil without talking about the Exxon Valdez, and definitely not in the inlet. This is a reminder that most of these accidents happen as the end result of human error. You can put as many safety precautions in place as you want. You can change the rules and regulations, but at the end of the day, we're only as safe as one captain and their mistake. And that's all it took with the Exxon Valdez. And the Queen of the North was a similar story. Somebody just sent me a news story the other day reminding me back in 2006 that a cargo vessel ran aground just off of Stanley Park. Luckily, there was no spillage, but I mean, there have been vessels that have run aground in the very same area that we're talking about. And of course, when you're looking at places like the Second Narrows Rail Bridge, where you've got very minimal clearance and quite treacherous waters. I mean, there's been many, many incidents there, and there's the potential for a horrible accident, unfortunately. If anybody tells you that double-hulled tankers are going to save us, you're noticing a trend here. I'm trying to provide you with some responses to the questions that I get asked all the time, because you're probably going to have these same conversations after you leave here. Double-hulled tankers won't save us. This was a tanker in Japan about 3 years ago. A double-hulled tanker, another vessel ran into it, and as you can see, it didn't stop it from spilling. Double-hull tankers, perhaps there's a little bit more security, but it isn't any guarantee. The Exxon Valdez was a single-hull tanker. Many people now tell us that double-hull tankers are the solution as kind of a response. There's plenty of evidence that that's not the case. Just for a sense of scale, the tankers we've got in the inlet right now, the smallest ones are about 150 meters. I think those are by and large the jet fuel tankers. The tankers that are about 150 meters are about the same size as the wall center. So if you can sort of picture the wall center on its side navigating its way through the inlet, that's the size of the smaller tankers. The bigger tankers that we have currently are somewhere between 250 and 300 meters. And one of the things that Kinder Morgan has talked about doing is actually increasing the dredging of the inlet to bring in even bigger tankers. But in terms of the ones that are in the inlet right now, they're between 250 and 300 meters. So just for a sense of comparison, the largest building in Vancouver, the Shangri-La Tower, is 200 meters. So the tankers we have in the inlet right now are bigger than the Shangri-La Tower. It's like, one and a half of the Shangri-La Towers, going through our inlet on a regular basis, carrying about 3 times as much oil as was spilled by the Exxon Valdez. So just to put a bit more detail on what Kinder Morgan's been up to since they bought the pipeline, in 2005 we had 22 tankers in the inlet. And that was about what's necessary to ship oil down to California to refine it and bring it back up as refined fuel products. There was a bit of exporting that was going on, but not a tremendous amount. We did see a little blip in the 1970s during the oil shock where there was an increase in exports. But very quickly after that, I think around when Reagan came in, that went back down again. And once again, this was, sweet light crude we were talking about, not the sour heavy stuff that the dill bit that we're talking about. So just as a baseline, there was about 22 tankers, mostly for local consumption. By 2008, Kinder Morgan had expanded by 50,000 barrels a day. They did what was called the Anchor Loop Project with very little press or awareness. They increased the amount of oil going through the pipeline. The end result of that was that by 2010, we saw 82 tankers in Burrard Inlet. And I'm not talking about the refined fuel product tankers, I'm just talking about the crude oil tankers. So about 60 of those were for the sake of export. And there was a report done in 2008 by a risk assessment panel, which actually very quietly gave permission to Kinder Morgan to start exploring the export of oil to Asia. So that's a very new thing. Somebody tells you that we've been doing this for a long time. We've been moving refined fuel products up and down the coast for a long time. There's risks associated with that for sure, but we definitely have not been a mass exporter of raw bitumen for a long time. That's a very new thing. So by 2016, Kinder Morgan plans to put in their proposal formally in 2014, and we anticipate that by 2016, what they would like to do is get up to about 300 to 400 tankers in the inlet. And the reason why there's that range is simply because if they dredge the inlet, they'll have bigger tankers and there'll be less of them. If they don't, they'll be the same size tankers we've got now and more of them. But in terms of volume of oil, they want to get up to that about 750,000 barrel a day number that they're hovering at now. And all the new capacity would be for the sake of export. So we set up a service to try to tell people when a tanker was actually in the inlet. I'm realizing I've been talking to you for a lot longer than I planned. How's everybody doing? All right, cool. Thank you. So what we did was we actually set up an automated system, and this was kind of before the Kinder Morgan issue was really on people's radar. We decided that in real time there was a way that we could actually make people aware of what was going on in our inlet. And what you can actually do is if anybody has a cell phone, you can pull it out, and don't be afraid of texting for anybody who's afraid of texting. I see a few people with gray hair in the audience who are looking at me like I'm talking another language. If you text the word oil to this phone number, what you'll get is every time a tanker goes and fills up at the Kinder Morgan terminal, we'll send you an update in real time. It'll tell you the name of the tanker, the size of the tanker, and you'll know, well, that tanker's there. And we thought this was an important thing to do because so much of this is happening under the radar without anybody knowing about it. And we thought it was important that people actually knew in real time when that threat was out there. So we set up this service as a way that while you're sitting in a restaurant or you're sitting around a kitchen table or wherever you are, you get a text message and it becomes a conversation starter. And you can start talking to your friends and neighbors about what's going on. Hey, did you know that these pipelines or tankers were out there? You shouldn't get too many text messages. Right now there's about a tanker or two a week. But if you start getting a text message every day, you know we're in trouble. And if you send a text back, I'll get it eventually and respond if you have questions or anything like that. So in terms of reminding us of what's out there, without the use of any cellular technology, the killer whales reminded us that they were out there recently too. And to me this was sort of an important moment. It's not that often that we see these orcas showing up in Burrard Inlet or in the Strait. Orca Pass, which is vitally important habitat, is not far away, but the tankers often, or the orcas often stay far away from the industry in its concentrated form in the Vancouver harbor. And this is the picture that Global TV took and posted on Facebook, and it kind of went viral. So I'm just sharing it with you because they wanted, I think, us to know that they were there. So I figured I'd show you their picture and help them out. But the orcas really have become a symbol of what's at stake and what we need to protect. And I guess one of the other things that I think is really important for people to understand from the Stanley Park report is one, that this is a different kind of oil and a different sort of business that these guys are doing. But another is that Stanley Park has already been pretty heavily impacted. Like I said, this is an area that's been impacted by industry over the years. And from reading the State of the Park report, what I've come to understand is, this is a park that has been impacted. It's had the effects of industry over years and years, the effects of use of the park over years and years. And when an area is already impacted, that makes it even more vulnerable. And I think that we have a role as stewards. If we love the place, we really have a responsibility to protect the place. I think we should take moments like this as a reminder that this isn't a sacrifice zone. Just because we're concerned about protecting the north from the Enbridge pipeline doesn't mean we need to sacrifice the south for the Kinder Morgan pipeline. And that's a narrative I've heard floating around there sometimes. I think we need to really address that head on. And the Stanley Park report tries to do that. It tries to say, look at what's at stake here. This isn't a sacrifice zone. This isn't an area that's, that we should just say has been given up to industry and to heck with the consequences if we bring more and more tankers in. This is an area that's teeming with life, with hundreds of bird species, with thousands of people that love it, and with many, many marine species that are part of that interconnected web of the park. So I think we need to remember that, as citizens of Vancouver, we not only get to enjoy it, but we also have a responsibility to protect it. And if our federal government's not going to step up and do the right thing, we really need to. So I've gone way over the time I was planning to talk, but I'm going to really quickly go through what I think is probably the number one question you'll get when you're talking about this with your friends and neighbors, which is, okay, but how do we get off oil? What are the alternatives? And I mean, the obvious thing that a lot of people jump to is, well, green energy, and of course that's important, and of course we need to be exploring green energy options. But tar sands oil is largely about transportation fuel. And if we're really going to kick our addiction to fossil fuels, we need to look at transportation. And we've got a new petition actually that's floating around right now. Somebody have one of those? They're at the table at the back, I know that for sure. If you haven't had a chance to sign it, you've probably already signed a tanker petition, but this one takes a slightly different approach where you're saying we want transit, not tankers. And as much as this is about export, at some level we all feel like, well, how can I be opposed to oil if I'm using it? And part of it's a personal responsibility, but part of it's also a land use and planning decision, and part of it's a transportation decision. I would be remiss if I didn't mention the words climate change while I was up here. The International Energy Agency has just recently reminded us that the infrastructure choices we make in the next 5 years will set the course that we head in the next 30 to 40 years. I think this is an important frame for us to remember. It's not just our emissions 30 years from now that we have to worry about. It's the choices we make in terms of infrastructure that set our course over the next few decades. And many of these old pipelines, old refineries, old power plants are reaching end of life. So we're kind of at an important moment right now where we're deciding, do we expand the use of oil? Do we build new pipelines? Do we replace those, bad old power plants and bad old refineries? Or do we look at a different way of living in relationship to the land? And really we have about 5 years, according to the International Energy Agency, which is far from a radical organization. I'm not sure if Harper would agree with that. But, couldn't help myself, thanks. What kind of infrastructure are we talking about? Luckily, there's some great work that's being done looking at how we can actually kick our addiction to fossil fuels. This guy, Patrick Condon, a professor at UBC, has done this great book called 7 Rules for Sustainable Communities. I'm not going to talk endlessly while I'm up here, but if you read this book, it'll give you a lot of insight into what we actually can do. And the great thing is that he actually used Metro Vancouver as a case study. So just to give you a little taste of it, this is the Port Mann Bridge. I'm sure all of you have been frustrated, stuck on the Port Mann Bridge, just like me. The problem is that building new lanes on highways doesn't actually get us out of congestion any faster. We're thinking about having a contest where you'll get to guess how long it'll be before the Port Mann Bridge reaches congestion again, and if you win, you get a free bus pass. So stay tuned. If you could build your way to congestion, LA would be the best place to drive on Earth, and of course it's not. And a big part of the reason why we've won most livable city so many years is because we made the right choices in the late 60s and early 70s. Unfortunately, we've been moving aggressively in the wrong direction in the last little while. So what Patrick Condon did was he looked at the cost of building the Port Mann Bridge, and then he compared it to what you could do with streetcar infrastructure in the city of Vancouver. And what you see there is the daylighting of old streetcar tracks in the solid lines and new possible streetcar tracks in the dotted line. And this is just an example of what you could do with basically the same amount of money as one project, which is actually not going to reduce congestion. You could do the same thing on the south of the Fraser, which has got way less public transit infrastructure. But of course, as you can imagine, this would generate a lot more jobs, it would reduce pollution, and would make the city more walkable, more livable. It might not be the right thing to do with this specific streetcar proposal, but it's just an example of sort of the scope of what could be done with the same amount of money. This is another, I think, sort of low-hanging fruit in terms of things that we should support in the Lower Mainland. This is the interurban rail line, is what you see in the blue, and in the yellow you see Highway 1 going through the Fraser Valley. And I'm not sure if you can quite see it, but The interurban rail line was built in the late 1800s, early 1900s. It stopped moving passengers in 1952. Same time that that pipeline was built, interestingly enough. There was a big shift happening. It was also right around when we were paving over all those streetcar tracks. And you know what you see in this is that most of those major cities were built right around that rail line, almost as if when you build rail lines, you get cities built around them. It's funny how that works. But the convenient thing about that is that this rail line is still there. It mostly moves coal these days, not people. Unfortunately, I'd like to reverse that. And if we brought back that interurban rail line, it costs a fraction of what it is costing to expand Highway 1, and would have huge, huge implications for jobs in the Lower Mainland and in the Fraser Valley. And of course, if there's about 1 million people that we expect to move to this region in the next decade, the question is, you know, where are they all going to move? If we build highways, we'll get sprawling car-based development with more pollution, more car dependence, more traffic, all the bad things that go with that. If we invest in light rail, that means people get out of their cars, they've got options, and they've got cheap and affordable ways to get from point A to point B, which sooner or later we're all going to need. As population grows, we're probably all going to get out of our cars just because of density. The only question is, are we going to sprawl the heck out of our land and waste a lot of viable farmland before we learn the lessons, or are we going to invest in smart alternatives up front? And I can tell you that like 80% of people when polled support this in that region. You know, so it would create a lot of jobs, it's got a lot of support, and it's a real easy kind of win-win thing we could do. And I'm getting right to the end here. This is the highest per kilometer greenhouse gas corridor in Canada. This is the corridor between Detroit and Quebec City. And what you'll see is that basically because of short-haul flights, because people fly for business from major urban centers, you know, and of course takeoff is the most carbon-intensive, pollution-intensive part of that trip, that many, many people are flying back and forth, and it's creating a lot of pollution and a lot of congestion and a lot of greenhouse gases. This corridor has been, you know, slated for a high-speed rail project for a really long time. And, you know, if you could actually get people more conveniently from point A to point B, gave them an option to get out of their cars and get off of those planes, you could have a really big impact on reducing greenhouse gases and pollution. You know, I mean, it's a development project. Every project's got a footprint, of course, but, you know, in terms of workable solutions, I think this is one we should be looking at. You know, it's all priced out. It's basically ready to go. It just needs a government that would support it. The other benefit of it is that there's a lot of auto workers who are looking for jobs in Ontario and, you know, are used to building big, heavy machinery. And we all happen to have some rail companies right in Canada too. You know, so it's an opportunity to, you know, make jobs in the environment be on the same team and do something really meaningful that ends our dependence on fossil fuels, or at least is part of phasing out our dependence on fossil fuels. I put this up because this is just an inspiring book. This kid from Africa, William Kemikwambe, his family was so poor that he could barely afford school fees, and they, you know, weren't producing enough food for his family to even really be able to eat, let alone to sell food. Long story short is that without speaking English, without any tools, without any money, he was able to build an operational wind turbine on his family's property. And then he actually built a second one, and they were able to do irrigation and crop rotation. And I mean, just a mind-boggling story if you haven't had a chance to check it out. The reason I show it to you, though, is if this kid can do this, you know, in one of the poorest places on earth with such lack of resources, I mean, he literally didn't even have tools. And he was able to do this. We have no excuse in one of the richest, wealthiest, you know, most, you know, blessed places on planet Earth here in Canada. You know, we say this is all about protecting our economy, and of course we need to protect our economy, but, you know, we do have a responsibility to do the right thing on the global stage. And, you know, there are plenty of good examples of people who have actually done the work that's necessary to produce electricity in other smarter ways. You know, so we really do have a responsibility, and if this kid can, you know, why the heck aren't we doing it? So I'm just going to end with saying, you know, if we do this, you know, we're creating good green jobs that are long-term, they're local jobs, you know, they can't be exported to China. They're the kind of jobs that work for us here locally. And I'm going to end on this note just simply because, you know, protecting Stanley Park is going to be the motivator, but, you know, everybody's going to come back to what about the jobs, what about the jobs, what about the jobs? So I'm trying to give you some tools. That concludes my presentation. Thank you all so much. I apologize. I talked a lot longer than I was planning. I guess that's the benefit of organizing your own event. But I really do hope you all stick around to hear Robyn and Niki and Sven. And if there's time, we're going to have question and answer. If people want to stick around longer, we were hoping to have a full question and answer session. But I'll definitely stick around and be happy to talk to people at the end as well. So thank you all so much. I just want to now take the opportunity to introduce Robyn Worcester from the Stanley Park Ecology Society.
Hello, my name is Robyn. I'm with the Stanley Park Ecology Society, and I just want to first of all thank Ben and the Wilderness Committee for putting on this event, and Tanker Free BC also for creating this report and inviting the Stanley Park Ecology Society to participate by providing this background information and inviting us here today. It was really exciting to know that our research and monitoring work in the park would be able to be used for this purpose, because I think it's a really important issue that people need to know about. So I'm going to just talk for a short amount of time, and I'm here just to represent the park and the wildlife, and I have a really great job where I get to work in the park every day and work with wildlife, so I'm just talking on behalf of that. So at the Stanley Park Ecology Society, our mission is to promote awareness of and respect for the natural world by playing a leadership role in the stewardship of Stanley Park through collaborative initiatives in research, conservation, and education. We've been working in Vancouver for about 25 years to educate the public about the environment and undertake research and conservation initiatives to monitor and rehabilitate the park's ecosystems. This report that they've written really illustrates how everything we've done in the park would be jeopardized by the increase of oil tankers moving through, or a large oil spill, or even just regular small oil spills if they were to occur. So when I started imagining what would happen if an oil spill hit the park, of course I know the park really well, having been going there since I was a little kid, but also working there every day. And so I really wanted to maybe create a bit of a picture of what it might look like if that were to happen. So I think the most dramatic thing people would notice, of course, would be the immediate death and oiling of all these really great organisms that we come to love along the shoreline there. Things like river otter, mink, raccoons, and seals. They immediately become oiled because they feed in the intertidal areas of the park. The fauna that they feed on, the fish, crabs, mollusks, clams, they would almost all be infected right away as well. Many of the top predators in Stanley Park are birds, and so things like bald eagles will be scavenging the seashore, and resident falcons and hawks that feed on birds and other seashore creatures. The great blue herons in the park are forming one of the largest urban heron colonies in Canada, and they rely almost exclusively on the little forage fish that are produced in the intertidal areas of English Bay and our inlet. And if there was a spill to occur at this time of year, when it's breeding season, that population of herons would probably not survive that, especially that colony of young herons would definitely fail, and this is a species at risk that would be brought closer to extinction just from an event like that. But what's scarier for me than just the immediate oiling of these big charismatic animals is really the long-term impacts on the whole ecosystem of the park, which would be felt for a long, long time afterwards. The intertidal organisms that form the basis of the food chain, things like the little worms and nematodes and biofilm, they would be affected by the oil and would interrupt the natural functioning of the ecosystem throughout the whole entire park. Although there's a big wall that separates the ocean from the rest of the park, I think that they're both intricately linked, and the oil would eventually find its way into the forest and the other upland habitats. We definitely see oil moving up Beaver Creek, which is one of Vancouver's 3 remaining salmon streams, probably up into Beaver Lake, which is one of our only intact wetlands. And as on the line of train of thought of salmonids, there's salmon that move past the park, coming into the inlet up to rivers and creeks that they're going to spawn in, and their fry also have to move through the inlet on the way out to the Pacific Ocean. I think for me, one of the most devastating effects of an oil spill or a chronic oiling of the park would be the loss of our local winter bird populations. SPES is a co-caretaker of the English Bay Burrard Inlet Important Bird Area of Canada, and this area has been given international recognition because of its large concentrations of overwintering waterfowl, including globally significant populations of birds like my favorite Barrel's goldeneye. Groups of over 3,000 surf scoters, you can regularly see them feeding on blue mussels along the shore in winter. And there's over 230 bird species that regularly use the park's resources. Many of these birds are also species at risk in BC, and they're also protected by the Federal Migratory Bird Act. We've already seen population declines for about 30 species of birds since the 1980s, and in the last 10 years we're seeing actually increased declines in some species, and I'm sure if you use the seawall you'll notice that as well. So the effects of a catastrophic oil spill, or even just an increase in small normal spillage, it is much more detrimental to this ecosystem, as Ben said, because it's already under stress. Our recent State of the Park report for the ecological integrity of Stanley Park identified aquatic ecosystems as being some of the most imperiled areas of Stanley Park, including the intertidal zones. They're already in poor condition due to pollution, habitat loss, and climate change. An increase in oil tanker traffic past Stanley Park would certainly hurt our dream of Vancouver, and I really hope that we can stop that from happening.
Thank you very much, Robyn. Here in Vancouver, we're very lucky to have a very progressive city council and city government, and we're honored to have 3 representatives from our city government here today. We have Park Commissioner Constance Barnes and we also have Commissioner Niki Sharma. And Niki is going to tell us a little bit about the work she's been doing at Parks Board and what the city is doing about the Kinder Morgan pipeline.
Hello everybody, thank you for coming this evening. Before I start, I'd like to thank the Wilderness Committee, Tanker Free BC, the Stanley Park Ecological Society, Rex Whaler, and all the other contributors that made this report about the Stanley Park. As Sven said, I come here today as a park commissioner, and I see some of my fellow park commissioners in the audience here, Constance Barnes and Aaron Jasper. And I just wanted to talk a little bit about the park board before I go on to the report. The park board is mandated to preserve and advocate for our park space, for our citizens and also for the environment. And I don't think it's an exaggeration to say that Stanley Park has helped to define the city. In 1886, the first resolution passed by the very first city council was to petition the federal government for 1,000 acres of park space, and that would later become Stanley Park. Shortly after, council established a park board mandated to protect the park space. And it's the only elected park board of this kind in Canada. So as I was saying, today I think Stanley Park is very synonymous with Vancouver, with the trails, the beaches, the seawall, the natural ecosystems, and the habitat. They're all treasured by Vancouverites and also our visitors that come to see this city. And as a park board, we've learned, and as a city, we've learned a lot over the years about our environmental responsibility. Now when we plan projects, we always think about the ecological integrity. We're always trying to make our spaces better and respect the environment that we all live in. One example is we work closely with our partners at the Stanley Park Ecological Society, and we're working to invest in making Beaver Creek a better place. And I think Robyn was talking about that. We've also passed a strategic plan recently to become leaders in greening, and we're working towards that goal in our park system. So the report that was presented presented, I think is it's very sobering for a park commissioner to talk about the potential damage that could happen to Stanley Park as a result of an oil spill. All of our work and the boards before us over the past 100 years to protect that park would be devastated in an event, and I think Robyn went over some of the impacts to the ecological integrity of the park if there was an oil spill. But there's also the other side of it. I'm not only representing the parks, but also the recreation in Vancouver. And just the other day, I was at Third Beach on a sunny day, and I was looking at how packed it was and how Vancouverites use the beach, use the water, whether it's swimming on a boat, just to lie on the beach. It's something that's part of our lifestyle. And at the park board, we're also mandated to protect our recreational activities in the city. And the report that was presented and talks, I encourage you to read it if you haven't, but it talks about the health effects. And Ben already talked pretty well about how the recent oil spill that was in Kalamazoo in the river and the immediate effects on the people. And that's something that we have to take very seriously. I think also in the report it talks about how 2 years after that spill, they're still not allowed to swim in that river because of the health effects. And I was thinking about that as I was at Third Beach, about how much of an impact that would have just on our lifestyle if that happened. One thing I'm very proud of is very recently the park board passed a motion to formally oppose the expansion of tanker traffic in Burrard Inlet. Has passed a similar motion, and we are committed to advocating against the expansion of the pipeline and the increase in oil tanker traffic. We are told by some that pipelines and the corresponding tankers are the safest way to transport oil. To these people I ask, how are we as residents of Vancouver supposed to be at ease given the series of oil spills over the past few years and even in the past few months? On top of this, the BC Oil Centre was shut down recently. There have been drastic changes in the environmental assessment process, the Fisheries Act, and many of our environmental protections. And even further, we just found out more recently that the Kitts Coast Guard is going to be closed down, which would be the first response if there was an oil spill in our inlet. So this leaves us less protected than ever before if there was an oil spill. And I don't think that's acceptable. And in closing, I just wanted to say, because I think it needs saying, is that we are not radicals, naive, or unreasonable people. We have all heard over and over again about oil spills and their devastating consequences. And today we even heard about normal spillage that would happen on a daily basis. We are people with legitimate concerns about expanded oil tanker traffic in our inlet. And I know as commissioners, and my colleagues here today would agree, we take protecting our parks very seriously. In closing, I would like to urge every resident of Vancouver to pay attention. Learn the facts, get involved. Determine if you think the risk is too great, because we need to work together on this to prevent a disaster, and we need your voice. Thank you.
Thanks so much, Niki. I got to say, I've been so inspired to see our city government standing up against this massive project. It really frustrates me when people say, well, it's not their jurisdiction, there's nothing they can do about it. Because what is that saying to you and us? Like if the Parks Board and the City Council has no power, then what are they saying in terms of our power? I mean, we all have a role to play as individuals, and we all have a role to play in our professional lives, and we all have a role to play as representatives when elected to office. This isn't just a matter of who's got what jurisdiction. This is a matter of what kind of province do we want, what kind of city do we want, what kind of country do we want. And we all have a role to play in this. One thing that Niki brought up reminded me of, after you put out these press releases and emails, you start getting a deluge of all these different people sending you information. And I was actually contacted by another Coast Guard official who wanted to make sure that you all knew that it wasn't just the Kitsilano Coast Guard station that was being shut down, but it's actually a number of Coast Guard stations. And in fact, the Marine Traffic Control Office, which I was lucky enough to get a tour of, which is literally where they sit and look out the window and try to make sure that boats don't run into each other. It just is amazing to me. I mean, even if you were the strongest supporter of pipelines and tankers, even if you were, Stephen Harper, what world it seems like a good idea to shut down a Marine Traffic Control Center, a Coast Guard station, the oil spill responders, while at the same time increasing the number of tankers. I mean, there was a report from our Auditor General that said we were woefully unprepared to deal with an oil spill a couple of years ago, and that was with the existing level of traffic and with the existing level of support. We're aggressively moving in the wrong direction. It's almost as if they're like trying to make a spill happen. I just don't get it. I just wanted to make sure that you knew about it. So I've already talked too much, I'm going to stop. I want to introduce you to Sven Biggs, who's working for Tanker Free BC. Sven and I have worked together for, 8 years now? Something like that. Sven's a fantastic organizer. He's one of those people that, rarely is actually at the microphone, is usually behind the scenes, actually making sure that events like this happen and we have everything you need so that you all can be able to, take part in these kind of organizing activities. And Sven's going to really focus on what we can do, what can be done, and how you can get involved. So please welcome Sven Biggs.
Tanker Free BC is working on a number of projects, and one of the things we're doing is a lot of our volunteers and board members work in the TV and film industry. So they put together the first of a series of public service announcements, and tonight is the launch of our first video. So in just a second.
What kind of risk would I take? Well, this one time I went on a blind date. It was set up by this guy I thought it was pretty safe. It was my boss. It was his daughter. She wasn't quite what I was expecting. What's a risk not worth taking? Well, I know one for sure. It's a risk not worth taking.
And I know we have a number of the volunteers and board members at Tanker Free BC who worked on this project. And I'm wondering if they could just stand up for a second to be acknowledged for their hard work. So the most common question that I get asked about this campaign is, how are we going to stop these things? And I guess it's a fair question because we're up against some pretty tough opponents. The entire federal government, it seems at times, some of the biggest oil companies in the world. But what it really comes down to in the end is that there is two kinds of power in the world. There's money and there's people. We know a little bit about the money that we're up against. We know that Enbridge has over $100 million to spend on PR through their environmental assessment process. We know that Richard Kinder, the chairman of Kinder Morgan, is one of the 100th richest billionaires in the world. We've seen what kind of influence this money can have. We've seen Enbridge's ads. And I can tell you that Kinder Morgan in September is going to start running their own multi-million-dollar ad campaign. But those ads are just the tip of the iceberg. The real money is spent behind the scenes, in back rooms in Ottawa, Victoria, and even in our own communities, where Kinder Morgan and Enbridge are working hard to buy off local governments, elected officials, First Nations, and even community groups. And we've seen how big oil's money is having an effect on our federal government. The unprecedented attacks on civil society, attacks on science itself, and most recently, the attacks on the very regulatory processes that would permit these projects in the form of Bill C-38. In the face of that, it is inspiring to see that there are still scientists that will not be silenced. There are environmental groups that will not be intimidated, and there's politicians that cannot be bought. But on their own, they can't stop these tankers and pipelines. We're going to need to use the power of people to stop these projects. That means you. We're holding these series of town halls so we can open up this campaign and allow people like you to come in and be a part of the solution. That's why I ask that before you leave tonight, you share your contact information with us, so we can continue this conversation and start building the movement that's going to be necessary to turn back these projects. We might even form a local neighborhood affinity group and start working right here in this community to find a solution. But even all of you aren't enough. We're going to need your friends, your families, and your neighbors. We're going to build a broad community of opposition. And we're going to need to talk to these people one by one for the most part, because not everyone is going to come to a meeting like this. So we're going to need to meet with people on the beaches of this city. We're going to need to talk to them in the streets sometimes. We're going to have to go door to door and talk to them on their doorsteps, and sometimes maybe even come into their houses and meet them around their kitchen tables. The best person to have those kind of conversations isn't me or Ben. It's you. You know your neighbors, you know your friends. So I'm here to draft you into the movement. We also have a couple of ongoing projects that I want to let you know about. We've been doing a series of canvases. The first one was last weekend. We were on the beaches of Stanley Park with Niki and volunteers from Vision Vancouver and Tanker Free BC. We're going to be holding the next one on July 21st. We'll be on Kitts Beach from 1 to 3, and there is a special beach volunteer sign-up sheet floating around out there. So if you're interested, please sign up or come talk to me afterwards. We've seen throughout history what kind of power people have, whether it's getting women to vote or the civil rights movement, as Rueben talked about earlier, ending apartheid, bringing down the Berlin Wall. It's that kind of mass movement that we're going to need to stop these projects. And tonight, I know that coming together, we're beginning to build that. So I want to thank all of you for being part of that movement, and I want to ask you to continue to work with us. Thank you so much.